So I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm found myself during those sort of two presentations, I suppose, as well as the Minister's sort of invitation to give voice out of today, really stimulating. And what I want to do very briefly, and I've asked Mary to give me a 2-minute warning because I like a lot of youth workers, I have a tendency, I'm well able to talk. I want to try and highlight some of the things from a piece of research called Standpoints that we in the Department of Applied Social Studies at what's now called Maynooth University did with the Development Education Programme in NYCI a couple of years ago. And I think one of the things that are sort of key about that piece of research is that it was sort of commissioned by the sector, by a youth work organisation, to actually look at what was happening in youth work, and in particular to look at young people and youth workers' attitudes to global justice issues. And it was done as a qualitative, small-scale piece of research, as distinct from the large-scale sort of attitudinal surveys that have been done in the past. And the first two slides very much, I suppose, capture some of the things that have already been mentioned today. And this was a comment by a young woman down in County Waterford, is my memory, is, oh yeah, that's terrible, somebody should do something about it, but not me. And that idea, you know, I think it speaks to some of what the Celtic Youth Bray were talking about in terms of the different sorts of attitudes. But what I want to do very briefly is just revisit some of the key points. So if you're, and I hope you are, interested in the research generally, it is one of the recommendations out of the research that it would be disseminated. It is available, I know, on the youth.ie website in PDF currently, but I think it does in some way to speak to some of the themes of the day. We sort of took our starting point very much at the time as NYCI's sort of understanding of what development education. And you can see very clearly that we were interested in moving beyond sort of awareness and understanding, but into action. And I think that's very consistent with the sort of messages that we've heard today already. In the research, we wanted to just try and identify and explore the sort of the levels of awareness and attitudes to a range of issues which we didn't predefine what the issues were, and we wanted in some way do it in a sort of an informal, non-formal, educative way that would allow people to sort of really encourage people to have a voice in framing those sort of definitions. That's really all that I'm going to say about the research itself. We did it in 3 different parts of the country. We wanted to have a geographical dimension. We wanted to have a rural-urban dimension. We wanted to have an organisational dimension. So we did the research in Dublin, Mayo and in Waterford, as it stands. And one of the exercises that we did was about very early on was going in to do sessions with young people and workers with different maps, different representations of the world, and asking people to act and interact and react to those. And I suppose my message really for today is what I've picked out of the research are the things that I think are incredibly positive, that we can work with, that we can amplify. And one of the things that we really found is that where they're given opportunities and where there is engagement, young people have a huge capacity to critically engage with very big world issues. So to move beyond that, like, oh, our young people aren't interested, I really resonated with that from Bray. So you can see the sort of things that people say. You know, one is the one you normally get, and one is how everything is. So young people are well able to distinguish between perceptions of reality and other perceptions of reality. You know, you realise, for instance, how big Africa is. What does that mean? The notion is a clarity about power. It's probably people from the north who get to make the maps. So I've certainly found those very interesting sort of very nuanced sort of insights from young people. The sorts of issues that young people identified, the world, divided up, rich and poor, very clear about those, and naming issues, pretty much which I think are sort of consistent with the issues across the board. And I think it's important to say that not all of these young people at all had been involved in formal development education programmes in youth work. We wanted that sort of spread. And you can see, I think it was very interesting, again, nuanced and somewhat, sadly, I suppose, sometimes somewhat cynical views about things. So very clear about unequal global relationships, do you know? And the notion of how power gets played out. That notion about Ireland being neutral but being aligned, do you know? And so the comments like, Ireland's neutral, supposedly, or not really, though. So again, I think quite nuanced, and a sense that that positioning of Ireland, and we often talk about Ireland as that the most globalised economy in the world, the small open economy, a real sense from among young people involved in projects that actually has huge consequences for things. And so one of the things I think that was that I think are the important things maybe for a grouping like this to consider is that young people struggled to make concrete connections between their own locality and the wider global issues. Although you could very easily, from a perspective of going into, Waterford or various parts of Dublin or the West, you could already see how some of those global things that Mamadou was talking about get played out in the locality. A sense of general sense of some helplessness as young people, and I think that's an important point, links back to what Mary was saying earlier, is that we always hear about this idea of young people being the young people, the future, that at some point in the future, young people will be able to act. And it's not then surprising that sometimes young people feel somewhat powerless to act. But some of them were able to talk about ways that they could take individual action. So again, going back to the Bray video about maybe choosing about where they would shop, maybe thinking about, well, maybe I won't go to Penneys and spend a tenner on an outfit for the night. Maybe I'll do something else. But the notion, too, of issues being far away. So even though we live in a globalised world, geography is still a really important part of how far away is far away, And I think the other thing that was, again, a little bit sad, I suppose, was a poor perception, because cynical, and it gets borne out by the situation, I think, of young people in Europe, research recently, is a somewhat cynical view of mainstream politics and charities. And, of course, hasn't been helped by the controversy of recent times. Some of the things that were emerging, formal education was significant. Where young people were able to give concrete examples, they specifically were able to talk about geography in particular in school as a place where they learned about things. But of course there was also a question about how global in that context were perceived and thought. An overarching thing around ambivalence, a knowledge that something was going on, but a real lack of clarity about how and where to act. Not a huge amount of thinking about citing of youth work and youth work experiences as a place to explore global issues. Although, the Scouts were the exception around that, which I thought was interesting. But overall, we felt that the fieldwork highlighted the capacity of young people to engage in complex issues and debate and discussion if the opportunities were created to do that. We also talked to youth workers. I just want to say a very few things about this, is that youth workers generally, the ones we interviewed, were generally very interested, had quite a nuanced take on things, had a good analysis, I suppose, in terms of the local global dimension. Really recognised the tendency to try and simplify things into very particular categories, but generally had quite a positive view and certainly some sense of their own choices in some way, and a critique also, which we thought was useful, about the notion of what we might call charity tourism as somewhat individualistic and lacking a charitable, lacking a political dimension. Again, the issues that the youth workers mentioned, the environment, the minority control of resources, capitalism, and so you can see a slightly, a different level of conceptualising of the issues. And also, I suppose, very clear naming and very particular issues around gender and racism. So that piece, I think, that Mamadou is talking about in here. It's not just out there, it's what's happening in here. In terms of the responding, what people were talking about and some of the questions we came up with, is a really strong need to try and link global issues with localised experience in some way about young people's everyday lives. And I think that's consistent with what we've heard this morning. So it's nice for me to see that the continued relevance of the research. I suppose big questions about how people can begin to change their own behaviour and then encourage those around them. So Mamadou's notion of provoking consciousness and action. The notion, too, in a lot of projects, which I think is interesting because we also have to look at the economic and social circumstances where young people live, so that simple things that we might see, like let's go buy fair trade, actually isn't always an option because of the expense. And the moral complexity of trying to make decisions. How do we make the right decision about things? So youth workers mentioned these things, a lack of organisational support and also a personal lack of knowledge of the issues. And we thought this was really interesting. An apprehension about getting into discussion, you know. And also a notion that, in a way, a structured programme, now we're going to do development education, was a sure way of just turning young people off, you know. And also, I suppose, recognising in some of the projects that the notion of justice, so we were talking about global justice issues, has a very particular resonance for young people. But there are some real opportunities. We did find examples of very planned and purposeful interventions, so people using One World Week in a very creative way, international food fairs, recycling projects, which on the face of it you go, what's the connection? But actually workers very deliberately making connections to global issues in terms of the environment. The notion too of working and learning with young people rather than needing to have the information and then give it to young people, so doing something collectively and collaboratively. And I think that the sort of a youth work approach we would love, I suppose, to see coming out of this is about enabling young people to put all of their experience in some way into a social and global context. So, points that we wanted to highlight. There was a lot of talk about what could be done rather than what is being done. A sort of a sense of an ambivalence. It was an overarching thing about, and with ambivalence sometimes comes a sort of a powerlessness. So there's the consciousness, but not necessarily the capacity to act. And a real clarity, and I think it goes back to one of Mamadou's points about a need to interrogate the key concepts and look at what's the connection between them so that we know what we're talking about. I'm just done. So some recommendations. We're talking about raising awareness about the overlapping of objectives of global justice work and youth work and how they can be best pursued. I think there is a real opportunity here to feed into the emerging youth strategy. I think that's really important. I think there is real opportunities, and Mary mentioned them. We have a national strategy for education for sustainable development, which names informal education and youth work in particular ways there. And we have the whole sort of post-2015 development agenda. There are other things, of course, but it just struck me that these were maybe particular ones. As a youth work educator myself, I think there's a real need to develop very particular post-qualifying or continuous professional development opportunities for youth workers to be able to do this work together and learn together in very consistent sort of ways. And finally, given the day that's in it and our idea is to try and work as positively as possible, so I took the opportunity to put down my dream. So my dream is that there would be a global justice dimension would be embedded across youth work, policy and practice. That we would work with young people in ways that enable them to make sense of their lives, examine the context within which their experience is shaped, an understanding of the global forces that shape those contexts so they can take action in and on those contexts. And that global youth work is practiced by all youth workers, that it's not seen to be optional, something that if you're really interested, not just the passionate and committed few, but something that is embedded into the very fabric or the weave of youth work, as Bray mentioned. That's it. Thank you very much.